The fog had thinned by late afternoon, lifting just enough to reveal the far fence line, where the land dipped and disappeared into a shallow ravine. Sunlight spilled to the clouds in pale ribbons, turning the dust in the air into something almost holy. He stood there longer than necessary, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the quiet labor of the ranch. Wind through dry grass, the distant creak of wood, the soft, uneven breathing behind him. The foal was awake again. It had been 3 years since the veterinarian's sentence. 3 years since the words no chance and humane option had settled into his bones like cold. He remembered the way the vet's eyes had avoided his, how professional certainty had wrapped itself around the diagnosis like armor. The foal had been smaller then, barely more than a tremor of ribs and will, its twisted leg tucked beneath it as if ashamed. That first winter, he had slept in the barn more nights than not, afraid that if he left, even for a few hours, he would come back to silence. He had learned to measure time in breaths. Now the foal, no, the horse, shifted its weight and rose with familiar effort. Joints protesting, balance negotiated inch by inch. There was nothing graceful about it, and yet the sight still tightened his throat. Each time felt like a miracle rehearsed but never diminished. The horse took a few careful steps toward him, favoring the leg that was never supposed to bear him, and stopped close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating through its coat. He rested his forehead against the animal's neck, a habit neither of them remembered starting, and closed his eyes. Footsteps approached from behind the barn, hesitant, uncertain. He didn't turn right away. He already knew who it was. He had seen her earlier at the gate, standing with her mother, fingers curled tight around the wire as if she were afraid the ground might give way beneath her. Lily was 8, small for her age, her body marked by its own negotiations with gravity and balance. She moved through the world carefully, the way the horse did, each step considered, each fall remembered. Is he okay today?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. He nodded and stepped aside, giving her space. The horse watched her with dark, patient eyes, ears flicking forward, curious but calm. Lily approached slowly, her braces clicking softly with each step. He saw the familiar fear in her posture, the anticipation of pain or failure, and felt something old stir inside his chest. He remembered learning how to stand again after his own life had folded in on itself, how the ground had felt unreliable for a long time. She reached out and touched the horse's shoulder, then withdrew her hand as if surprised by its warmth. The horse didn't move. It simply breathed. Lily laughed, a small sound, startled and bright, and in that instant the air seemed to shift. Her mother watched from a distance, hands pressed together, eyes wet but silent. Can I sit?" Lily asked. He hesitated, not because he doubted the horse, but because he understood the weight of the moment. Every risk he had ever taken with this animal had been for it, not for what it might do for others. But the horse lowered itself without being asked, folding its legs carefully, deliberately, as if a decision had already been made. The movement was slow, controlled, and offering. Time stretched thin. Lily's mother inhaled sharply. He felt his heart pound against his ribs, loud enough that he wondered if anyone else could hear it. Lily placed her hands on the horse's back, steadying herself, and with his quiet guidance, eased her weight down. The horse shifted once, then stilled, muscles firm beneath her. Lily sat upright, eyes wide, her face caught between disbelief and joy. For a moment, no one spoke. The ranch held its breath. Then Lily smiled, a full, unguarded smile that seemed to light something deep and dormant in the people watching. Her mother covered her mouth, a sob breaking free, despite her effort to contain it. He felt tears on his own face, and didn't bother to wipe them away. The horse stood again after only a few seconds, careful as always, and Lily slid back to ground, laughing now, her laughter ringing against the barn walls. She threw her arms around the horse's neck, and the horse accepted it, patient, solid, alive. In that embrace, he understood what the veterinarian never could have predicted. Survival was only the beginning. What mattered was what grew in the space beyond it. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold, he watched Lily walk back to her mother, a new confidence in her step. The horse followed him to the fence line and stopped there, standing beside him, both of them silhouetted against the fading light. He rested his hand on the familiar curve of its neck and felt the steady rhythm beneath his palm. He had thought he was defying a diagnosis. He had believed he was saving a life to make up for the ones he couldn't save before. But standing there, with the echoes of Lily's laughter still hanging in the air, he realized the truth was larger and quieter than that. The horse had not survived in spite of its brokenness. It had survived because of it. Because broken things recognize each other. Because they teach us how to stand without pretending the ground is easy. Night settled gently over the ranch. He and the horse remained where they were, neither eager to leave the moment behind. Somewhere inside him, something long closed began to open, not with pain, but with purpose. He knew now that this was no longer just a place where one animal had been given a chance. It was becoming something else, something alive with possibility. And the story was only just beginning. Time moved differently after that afternoon. It no longer dragged its feet or rushed past him without warning. It widened. Days opened into one another like long, forgiving breaths, and the ranch began to change in ways he hadn't planned and couldn't have orchestrated if he tried. Word traveled softly at first, carried by neighbors and parents and people who spoke with their hands folded, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. They came not because he advertised or invited them, but because hope has a way of finding cracks to slip through. The horse aged into its body the way some souls do, slowly, deliberately, never pretending to be what it wasn't. The limp remained, a visible reminder of all that had almost ended before it began, but strength settled into the rest of him. His coat darkened and shone in the sun. His eyes grew calmer, wiser, holding the quiet patience of something that had learned survival without bitterness. When he moved to the pasture, other animals adjusted their pace around him, as if they understood that speed was not the point. People brought their broken places with them. A teenage boy who hadn't spoken since his father died stood at the fence for weeks before daring to step inside. An older man with hands that shook too much to hold a coffee cup found that brushing the horse steadied him in ways medication never had. A young mother sat on an overturned bucket, watching her child touch the horse's muzzle for the first time, and wept without sound. No one explained why it worked. They only noticed that it did. He watched it all with a mixture of awe and restraint. Part of him was still afraid to claim this as his life, as if naming it might cause it to disappear. He fixed fences, repaired old stalls, built ramps where there had only been steps before. He learned to listen more than he spoke. When people thanked him, he nodded and changed the subject. Gratitude, he had learned, belonged to the moment, not the ego. The horse stayed close to him during those days, shadowing his movements, resting when he rested, standing watch when he spoke quietly with someone whose pain had finally found words. There were moments when their breathing aligned so perfectly it felt choreographed. Two lives tuned to the same frequency. At night, when the ranch settled into darkness, he often found himself leaning against the stall door, listening to the steady sound of the horse's sleep, reassured by its constancy. One evening, after most of the visitors had gone, he sat alone in the barn, the smell of hay and dust thick in the air. The horse stood beside him, head low, eyes half-lidded. He reached out and pressed his palm to familiar warmth, grounding himself. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about the future without fear, not in grand plans or promises, but in images. More space, more hands, more time given freely to those who needed it. The thought didn't overwhelm him. It settled, fitting where despair once had. The veterinarian returned that winter, older now, quieter. He walked the pasture with measured steps, watching the horse move, stopping often, as if recalibrating his understanding of what was possible. When he finally spoke, his voice held no defense, only wonder. He said something about statistics and outliers, about lessons learned too late. He apologized, not with words, but with the humility of his silence. It was enough. Snow fell early that year, softening the land, muting the world. Children bundled in oversized coats laughed as they trudged through drifts, their breath puffing white in the cold air. The horse stood among them, patient, solid, accepting the clumsy affection of mittened hands. He watched from the barn door, a mug warming his palms, and felt something like peace settle into his chest. Not the absence of pain, but the knowledge that pain no longer defined the edges of his life. Late one night, long after the ranch had gone quiet, he returned to the pasture. The moon hung low, casting silver across the snow. The horse lifted its head as he approached and stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders brushed. He leaned into that contact, feeling the familiar strength, the shared history held in muscle and bone. He thought of the morning he had found the foal, of the choice that had seemed so small at the time, stay or walk away. He understood now that the world is shaped by such moments, unremarkable until they aren't. He rested his forehead against the horse's neck and closed his eyes. In the stillness, he felt the truth settle fully, finally. Healing was not a destination reached by the unbroken. It was a path walked by those willing to remain present, to stand beside what was wounded without demanding it become something else. The horse shifted slightly, steady as ever, and breathed. When he opened his eyes, the night seemed less vast, the future less uncertain. He knew there would be more challenges, more losses, more days when hope felt thin. But he also knew this. Broken beginnings did not dictate broken endings. The ranch, the horse, the people who would come next, they were all part of something unfolding, something resilient and alive. He stayed there until the cold crept through his coat, until the stars began to fade, and the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Then together, he and the horse turned back toward the barn, carrying with them the quiet certainty that what they had built would endure, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Spring arrived without ceremony, slipping into the valley on softened ground and longer light. The snow retreated in patches, revealing grass that looked impossibly green after months of white. With it came more people, not in crowds, but in singles and pairs, each carrying something unspoken. The ranch no longer felt like a place discovered by accident. It felt chosen. He noticed a change most in himself. He woke earlier, not from worry, but from anticipation. His movements carried intention now, guided by a quiet confidence he hadn't known he possessed. He built what was needed as it became clear it was needed. Another shelter, wider gates, paths that curved gently instead of cutting straight lines. The horse followed him everywhere, a steady presence at his shoulder, its hooves a familiar rhythm against the earth. Together, they moved as if rehearsed, as if years of shared survival had refined them into something seamless. One afternoon, a bus pulled up at the edge of the property, its engine idling uncertainly. He watched from the porch as a group of teenagers stepped down, some laughing too loudly, others staring at the ground. Their counselor spoke quietly with him, words heavy with caution. These were kids who trusted nothing, who carried anger like armor. He nodded, not needing details. The horse stood nearby, ears flicking, calm as stone. At first, the teens kept their distance, skepticism etched into their posture. But the horse did not approach them. It simply existed, unbothered, unafraid. Slowly, one boy stepped forward, then another. Hands reached out, tentative, then firmer. The horse accepted them all the same. By the end of the day, laughter echoed across the pasture, sharp and surprised, as if no one had expected it to come from their own throats. He watched from afar, understanding that trust does not announce itself. It reveals itself when no one is looking for it. As weeks passed, stories layered themselves into the land. A veteran who hadn't slept through the night in years fell asleep in the shade of the barn, the horse standing guard beside him. A girl who flinched at sudden sounds learned to breathe again with her hand resting against a warm flank. Each moment was small, easily overlooked, but together they formed something undeniable. Healing was happening, not as a miracle, but as a practice. The climax came quietly, the way all true turning points do. It was a community gathering, informal, unplanned. Families stood along the fence line. Children perched on rails, elders seated on folding chairs. He hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't prepared anything at all. The horse stood in the center of it, sunlight catching the scars along its leg, the visible history of every reason it should not have been there. A young boy stepped forward, guided by his mother. The boy's legs trembled, his confidence fragile. He had never stood without support. The mother's hands shook as she let go. The horse lowered itself, slow and deliberate, offering its back without instruction. The boy climbed, awkward and unsure, and for a moment, the world held still. Then the boy straightened, his face breaking open in astonishment, his laughter cutting through the silence like light through cloud. The sound rippled outward. Gasps, tears, hands pressed to mouths. He felt it then, not pride, not triumph, but a deep, grounding certainty. This was why he had stayed. This was why the horse had survived. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to show what becomes possible when brokenness is met with patience instead of judgment. As the sun dipped low and people began to drift away, he remained by the pasture, watching the horse graze, peaceful and unremarkable in the best possible way. He understood now that the legacy forming here did not belong to him alone. It belonged to everyone who had arrived believing they were beyond repair and left knowing they were not. When night came, he walked the fence line one last time, the horse beside him, the air cool and alive with promise. He placed his hand against the familiar warmth and felt the steady pulse beneath it. Tomorrow would bring more stories, more wounds, more chances to stay. And for the first time in his life, he was ready for all of it. Time widened again, stretching into seasons that layered gently over one another. The ranch no longer felt like an exception to the world beyond it. It felt like a quiet answer. Mornings arrived with purpose, evenings with gratitude. The horse aged with dignity, its once fragile body now a living testament to endurance rather than limitation. The limp never disappeared, and no one tried to hide it. It became part of the story told without words, a reminder that strength does not erase its origins. He watched children grow taller, their voices deepen, their fears loosen their grip. Some returned years later, standing at the same fence line where they had once hesitated, bringing others with them. They pointed to the horse, as if pointing to proof. Proof that pain could be carried without becoming the whole of you. Proof that survival could turn into service. One late summer afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky darkened fast, wind tearing through the valley, rain striking the ground in hard, sudden sheets. He moved instinctively, guiding people toward shelter, counting heads, calling names. Thunder cracked close enough to rattle the barn doors. In the chaos, a child froze near the pasture, fear locking her in place. Before he could reach her, the horse moved. Step by careful step, it crossed the wet ground, positioning itself between the child and the noise, lowering its head until its presence filled her field of vision. She pressed herself against its neck, sobbing into its mane as rain soaked them both. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving the world rinsed and trembling. When it was over, the child looked up, eyes red but steady, and smiled. He felt his chest tighten, the familiar ache of all settling in again. That night, long after the lights were out and the ranch lay quiet, he sat in the barn alone. The horse stood nearby, breathing slow and deep. He thought about the man he had been before the foggy morning years ago, the one who had believed endings were final, that lost to find the limits of a life. He understood now how small that vision had been. Life, he had learned, was less about avoiding breakage and more about choosing what to do with it when it came. He rested his head against the stalled door, listening to the steady rhythm that had once kept him awake with fear and now carried him toward rest. Outside, crickets sang and the stars spread wide across the sky. The future no longer felt like something to brace against. It felt like something to walk into, slowly, deliberately, one careful step at a time. Before leaving the barn, he turned back once more. The horse met his gaze, calm and knowing. In that shared silence, there was no need for gratitude or vows. Everything that mattered had already been exchanged. Somewhere beyond the fence line, the world continued in all its noise and hurry. But here, in this pocket of patience and presence, something rare endured. Not a miracle frozen in time, but a living, breathing reminder that what is broken can still become a place where others learn how to stand. The first frost of the season came quietly, silvering the grass before dawn and sharpening the air with a clean, deliberate chill. He noticed in the way the horse exhaled, breath rising in pale clouds, and the way his own joints protested as he crossed the pasture. Time had marked them both now, not with defeat, but with evidence. They were no longer becoming something. They had become. The ranch carried a rhythm that no longer depended on him alone. Volunteers arrived before he unlocked the gates. Coffee brewed without his prompting. Laughter drifted from the far paddock where a group of children worked together, slower ones guiding faster ones, everyone learning the pace of patience. He watched from a distance, careful not to interfere. Leadership, he had learned, sometimes meant stepping back far enough for others to step forward. The horse moved among them with the same steady awareness it had always carried, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. When a child grew overwhelmed, it paused. When someone needed courage, it stood firm. There was no training manual for this, no system, just a presence that seemed to understand what people were asking for before they found the words themselves. One afternoon, an old truck pulled up at the gate, its engine coughing as if uncertain it had made the right journey. A man stepped out slowly, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the land as though expecting it to disappear. He carried himself like someone who had survived too much by trusting too little. They spoke only briefly. Names exchanged. Nothing more. The man did not ask questions. He only nodded once and followed him toward the pasture. The horse was resting near the fence, eyes half closed, soaking in the sun. When it stood, it did not hurry. The man stopped a few feet away, hands clenched at his sides. He did not reach out. He did not speak. Minutes passed. Wind moved through the grass. Somewhere, a gate creaked open and shut. Then the man's shoulders dropped, just slightly. He exhaled, long and uneven, and pressed his forehead against a fence post, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The horse stepped closer, resting its muzzle against the wood, close enough to feel. The man did not cry. He simply stood there, breathing, the tension slowly draining from his frame. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were clearer, lighter. He said only one thing before leaving. "I'll be back." That evening, as the sun slid low and painted the land in amber, he walked the pasture alone with the horse beside him. He thought about how many people had arrived at the ranch believing they were beyond help, how many had left carrying something softer than they brought. He had stopped counting long ago. Numbers felt irrelevant now. What mattered were moments like this, quiet, unrecorded, profound. He stopped near the far fence, where the land dipped and the horizon stretched wide. The horse halted with him, shoulder to shoulder, both of them facing the same open distance. He felt the familiar warmth, the steady presence that had once been fragile enough to fit in his arms. A memory surfaced, uninvited but gentle. The fog, the twisted leg, the choice to stay. It no longer hurt to remember. It grounded him. The horse shifted, leaning into him slightly, and he smiled. Not the careful smile of someone protecting themselves from disappointment, but the easy one of someone at peace with uncertainty. He understood now that nothing here was permanent. Not the ranch, not the horse, not even himself. But the impact would remain, carried forward in ways he would never fully see. As dusk settled and the first stars appeared, he turned back toward the barn. The horse followed, its gait uneven but confident. Each step a quiet declaration. Together, they moved through the fading light, not chasing miracles, not defying fate, but living proof that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin when someone chooses not to walk away. The years softened the edges of everything. Even grief, he learned, could be worn smooth by use, transformed from something sharp into something that fit more gently in the hand. The ranch bore the marks of time the same way the horse did. Not hidden, not erased, but carried with quiet dignity. Boards weathered, paths deepened where feet returned again and again. The land remembered. He noticed how people lingered longer now. They no longer arrived with the restless urgency of those seeking to be fixed. They came with patience, with curiosity, with a willingness to sit in silence. Some brought lunches and stayed the afternoon. Others returned season after season, measuring their lives against the steady constancy of this place. The horse remained at the center of it all, not as a spectacle, but as an anchor. It greeted no one dramatically. It did not perform. It simply was, and that seemed to be enough. One morning, as light filtered through the slat of the barn, he found himself watching the horse more closely than usual. The gray around its muzzle had deepened. Movement took longer now, the careful rise more deliberate, the pauses more frequent. There was no fear in this realization, only awareness. He rested his hand against the familiar warmth and felt the steady, reliable pulse beneath the skin. It comforted him, even as it reminded him that nothing was promised beyond the present moment. A group of children arrived that afternoon, quieter than most. One of them held a folded piece of paper, so tightly it had softened at the edges. She waited until the others had wandered off before approaching him, her eyes flicking between his face and the horse. Without speaking, she handed him the paper. Inside was a drawing, simple lines, uneven colors. It showed a horse standing beside a person, both of them surrounded by what might have been sunlight or might have been hearts. At the bottom, in careful letters, were the words, "Thank you for staying." He swallowed hard and folded the paper back into his pocket, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. When he looked up, the child was already walking away, her task complete. The horse shifted closer, its shoulder brushing his arm, grounding him in the now. He realized then that he would never fully understand the reach of what had grown here, and perhaps that was the point. As dusk approached, clouds gathered low on the horizon, thick with the promise of rain. The air changed, pressure building, the world holding itself in anticipation. He led the horse toward the barn at an unhurried pace, both of them accustomed to the signals of weather and time. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not threatening, just present. The first drops fell as they reached shelter, darkening the dirt, releasing the sharp scent of earth. He stood in the doorway and watched the rain come down, thinking of all the mornings that had begun with fog and uncertainty, all the nights that had ended with quiet resolve. He thought of the man who had arrived here once upon a time, broken in clothes, convinced that saving one life might somehow redeem his own. He smiled softly at the memory, not with judgment, but with compassion. Growth, he understood now, often begins with incomplete truths. The horse settled into its stall, head low, eyes calm. He lingered there longer than necessary, tracing familiar lines with his gaze, memorizing the way the light fell across a scar, the curve of a neck that had once fit against his chest in the dark. There would come a day when this ritual would end. He did not push the thought away. He let it exist, honoring it by not letting it steal the moment in front of him. Outside, the rain eased, leaving the world rinsed and reflective. He stepped back into the barn one last time before turning in for the night. The horse lifted its head and met his eyes, the connection immediate and unspoken. He rested his forehead against the stall door, breathing in familiar scent of hay and dust and animal warmth. In that stillness, he felt no regret, only gratitude for the choice to stay, for the courage to care, for the understanding that healing is not an event, but a practice renewed each day. When he finally turned away, the path ahead felt clear, even if it was not entirely known. The ranch would continue. The stories would keep unfolding. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, the lesson would endure, that life does not ask us to be unbroken, only to be present, and to remain when remaining feels hardest. The first sign came in the way the horse hesitated at the water trough, standing still longer than usual, as if listening to something only it could hear. He noticed it immediately. Years of quiet attention had tuned him to the smallest shifts, the extra breath before a step, the pause where there used to be certainty. He didn't rush forward or call out. He simply waited, offering presence instead of alarm. The horse drank eventually, slowly, and lifted its head with the same calm eyes. But something in the air had changed. Autumn returned with gentler colors this year, the leaves fading into muted golds and browns, the mornings cool without being cruel. Visitors still came, though fewer stayed long. It was as if the ranch itself understood the season it had entered and adjusted accordingly. There was no sadness in it, just a soft narrowing, a drawing inward. He found himself spending more time alone with the horse, walking shorter paths, stopping more often. Silence felt fuller now, weighted with shared history. One afternoon, a woman arrived with her teenage son, tall and withdrawn, his shoulders curved inward as if trying to disappear. They stood by the fence while the horse grazed nearby. The boy said nothing, but his eyes followed every movement, every careful step. After a long while, he asked, barely above a whisper, "Does it hurt?" He understood the question, without needing clarification. He shook his head slowly. "It did," he said. "Sometimes it still does, but not in the way you think." The boy nodded, absorbing that, and stepped closer. He rested his hand against the fence, then against the horse's neck when the distance closed. The contact lingered. Something eased in the boy's posture, a tension releasing its grip. They left quietly not long after, gratitude expressed only in a brief look back. He watched them go, knowing that moment would stay with them, long after the details blurred. As the days shortened, the horse's strength waned gently, like a tide receding rather than a storm breaking. There were no emergencies, no dramatic declines. Just a gradual asking for more rest, more stillness. He adjusted without complaint, rearranging routines, sleeping closer again as he had in the beginning. The symmetry did not escape him. Life, it seemed, often closed its circles with care. On a clear evening, sky washed clean by cold air, he led the horse to the far fence one last time. The horizon stretched wide, the land breathing under the open sky. The horse stood beside him, leaning slightly, trusting. He placed his hand where he always had, feeling the familiar warmth, the slower rhythm beneath it. He did not speak. There was nothing left that required language. He thought about all the people who had stood where he stood now, broken in their own ways, searching for proof that gentleness could survive in a harsh world. He thought about the morning fog, the impossible choice, the years that had followed because of it. Staying had never been easy, but it had been right. As dusk settled, the horse lowered its head and rested it briefly against his chest, the way it had when it was small enough to fit there. The gesture undid him. He closed his eyes and breathed through the ache, through the gratitude, through the love that had grown quietly, stubbornly, without conditions. When he opened his eyes again, the stars were beginning to appear. He guided the horse back toward the barn, slow and steady, matching its pace. Inside, warmth waited. Familiar sense. Safety. He stayed with it until sleep came easily, until the rise and fall of its breathing evened out. Later, alone in the doorway, he looked out across the darkened land. He felt no fear of what was coming, only reverence for what had been. The ranch would go on. The people would keep arriving. The lessons would continue to unfold, carried forward by memory, by story, by lives changed in quiet ways. He turned off the light and let the night hold them both, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, the truth they had lived together could not be undone. He stood at the fence, the horse beside him, and watched the sun sink below the horizon. The sky burned gold and violet, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly still. He pressed a hand to the horse's neck, feeling the warmth, the steady rhythm beneath it, and he understood something he had never known before. That staying, that choosing care in the face of despair, had created something larger than either of them. Some stories end quietly, some loudly, but this one would live in every heart it had touched. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.